All right, good afternoon and welcome to Lunch with League. My name is Taryn Upchurch and I serve this year as co-president of the League of Women Voters of San Jose and Santa Clara, a nonpartisan political organization that also covers the cities of Milpitas, Morgan Hill, and Gilroy. Our purpose is to encourage informed and active participation in government and to influence public policy through education and advocacy. We do not support or oppose any political party or candidate. Each month, we host a speaker who can share with us information and ideas that will help broaden our understanding of issues in our community. This month, we are pleased to welcome Zulma Maciel, Director of the City of San Jose Office of Racial Equity, who is going to discuss the Welcoming San Jose Plan, an ambitious set of strategies to improve equity, inclusion, and sense of belonging among immigrants and refugees in San Jose. Zulma has worked in public service for more than 2 decades. In 2015, she became the first director of San Jose's Office of Immigrant Affairs and led the development of the Welcoming San Jose Plan. Zulma is binational with citizenship in both Mexico and the US, and is bilingual and bicultural. After Zulma's initial presentation, we will have time for questions, so please send them through chat as they occur to you. Please join me in giving a warm virtual welcome to Zulma Maciel.
Thank you, Taryn. And good afternoon, everyone. It really is a pleasure to be here with you again. I remember being a part of the League's luncheon series in March of 2021, pretty early on when we had established the Office of Racial Equity. And so super glad that I was invited to be back to talk to you specifically about the Welcoming San Jose Plan. There's a set of slides that we're going to share with you, but before we get started, you could share the first slide. I just want to provide a little bit of background on who I am. As Taryn mentioned, my name is Zulma Maciel. My pronouns are she, her, ella, and I come here as a daughter of immigrant parents who traveled to the US in search of a better life, who worked hard to provide for a family here and in Mexico. I come here as an English learner rooted in 2 languages, 2 countries, 2 traditions, 2 cultures, and 2 worlds. I'm the proud mother of 2 wonderful people, my son Leo, who's 19, and my daughter Samira, who's 24. I'm also here as a 25-year veteran of public service, anchored in the value of responsibility to make life better for the people we work for. So again, thank you to the League of Women Voters for inviting me to speak about the city's inclusion and belonging work. I believe that the impetus of this conversation was that the city of San Jose was recently named among the country's top most welcoming and inclusive cities by the New American Economy Cities Index, which examines the relationship between welcoming immigration policies and the municipal economic health. And so there was a recent article that basically highlighted the fact that San Jose was one of the most welcoming cities. The index also found by this New American Economy Index that proactive welcoming plans, like the one that City of San Jose has, make cities much more competitive for business and economic investment. And so I'm going to briefly highlight pieces of the plan, and we'll try to weave in how this intersects with the racial equity work. I also want to preface today's discussion that while we, the City of San Jose, take great pride in being named one of the most welcoming cities in the US, we also recognize that this is only the beginning. We know that there is substantial work to be done in San Jose and across the region, and we are committed to ensuring that San Jose is a place where everyone feels like they belong. So on the next slide, just a little bit of grounding on where the welcoming work sits in this larger City of San Jose organization. I am the director of the Office of Racial Equity. I was the former director of Immigrant Affairs. We've now merged the offices. It just makes sense. But what we realized that when we were doing a lot of the immigrant-focused work with an immigrant lens, we realized that programs and that we were partnering with our community-based organizations were only taking us so far. That we really needed to look at institutional change to make our policies and practices much more friendly to immigrants and refugees. And so that led the work to really diving deeply into talking about race. And so when we think about the work of the Office of Racial Equity, it really is intersectional. It means that we can, while we begin with race, we don't end with race. We think about immigrants, refugees, women, persons with disabilities. We think about the intersectionalities with LGBTQ. And so we know that some progress has been made over the years when it comes to racial equity. Yet if you look at any measure of success, whether it be income, education, health, criminal justice, there are significant differences in outcomes based on race that remain deep and pervasive. So the Office of Racial Equity was established to keep in mind the fact that these inequities persist. And so thinking through about what is the role of local government to ensure that we minimize those disparities. So the Office of Racial Equity is not here necessarily to solve all inequities in the region or in San Jose, but we are here to enable the city organization to embed a racial equity practice that will examine and improve San Jose's internal policies, programs, and decision-making so that ultimately we improve outcomes for immigrants and communities of color. And what I mean by that is that we have about 20 departments in the city, from the airport to the zoo. We are, and the tiny office of, my 6 colleagues and I are not responsible for reversing all of the bad policies that have been created over, decades in all of those departments. But what we can do is arm the organization with information and tools. And so how we do this and how we support and enable the organization to do better and to embed racial equity as a practice is we provide trainings. We recently, our city manager has taken a leader in racial equity, and she said everyone is mandated to take a foundational racial equity training, meaning that people understand the concepts and the terminology and the framework, and recognize the role of government in owning and advancing racial equity. So in that foundational racial equity training, we took that citywide, and about 6,000 employees participated in a 2-part training in the spring. We also provide technical assistance to departments. We're currently supporting the housing department on a housing element plan. We've supported the Department of Transportation and some of their emerging mobility. We're supporting the Mayor's Gang Prevention Task Force and their new strategic plan. We're supporting the development of a children's and youth agenda. And so there are a variety of ways that we provide technical assistance, because the people in our office are equity practitioners and can ask the critical questions when drafting these plans that actually influence where dollars go, the allocation of dollars, as well as policymaking. We also create and develop tools and processes. So we were involved, I think one of the questions that was asked prior to the webinar that was submitted in advance was, how was the office involved in the city's budget process? And how was an equity lens applied? Well, we created a budgeting for equity tool that every department was mandated to submit, that had a series of questions that they needed to ask that really centered around, what is it that you're proposing in a budget proposal? What does the data tell you about what this proposal will do, or any history? Was the data disaggregated by race? Did you ask community what they thought, right? Did you embed and did you engage community meaningfully to embed their voice into this proposal? And ultimately, what are you trying to get, and how will we hold each other accountable to making sure that these budget proposals actually lead to better outcomes for communities of color? We also share information and best practices from other cities. While this is fairly new work, there are 300 other municipalities across the US who have embarked in racial equity work. We also review policies and practices, and we also are trying to create a framework for meaningful community engagement. On the next slide, I'm going to get into the welcoming piece, the welcoming and belonging. So just to set some context, the city of San Jose is one of the most diverse cities in the country. In fact, we're right behind Miami, which is the most diverse city in the country. Almost 40% of the residents living in San Jose are foreign born, and that includes a variety of immigration statuses from undocumented to recently naturalized citizens. Over on the right, you'll see other data points. But what's important to here is to recognize the wonderful diversity that we have in San Jose. We know that while nearly 40% are foreign born, that many more San Jose residents have immigrant relatives and family members, with approximately 60% of children having at least one immigrant parent. We know that more than half of the immigrants in San Jose are naturalized citizens, while 21% are undocumented. And so it's important for us to recognize and celebrate the diversity. And that's good, but that's only part of it, right? We want to make sure that immigrants feel a sense of belonging, while we're thinking about immigrants and refugees and welcoming them in ways that are just more performative, but also where our systems work on their behalf, we also must not forget that Black, Indigenous, Chicanos, people of color who have been here for a really long time also desire to feel welcomed, and that immigrant justice and racial justice work are intertwined. On the next slide, you'll find elements of the Welcoming San Jose plan. It's a plan that was adopted by the City Council over a year ago. It was a plan that was developed with community, particularly community-based organizations that work closely with immigrant and refugees. What we're aiming for here is we want to be able to facilitate and accelerate immigrant inclusion in civic, economic, linguistic, and social aspects in San Jose. We know that truly welcoming places are grounded in welcoming values and practices of government leadership. For example, equitable access, civic engagement, connected communities, education, economic development, and safe communities are all parts of the pillar. We also recognize that the plan is both aspirational and actionable, but these 4 pillars get to the root of the kinds of things that local government and partner organizations can do to establish equitable systems, policies, and practices throughout the city to ensure that we improve immigrant access to city information and services and augment immigrant participation in civic life. An example that I'll give you on this one is that when we first started this work, we thought that it would be enough to have a sort of a civic leadership academy, one in English and one in Vietnamese, for people to understand how government works and perhaps create a pathway to getting local immigrants into boards and commissions. And so while our intent was good, right? Like let's create sort of a leadership academy that would create an understanding of how local government works and understand the various roles of different departments. What we realized that while our intentions were good, the system really isn't set up for people who are limited English speakers, for people who don't have time to come to, participate on city council meetings during the day, that our system really wasn't set up to engage immigrants in meaningful ways. Our system really was set up with a certain dominant culture and dominant population in mind. And that was people who could speak English, people who had the luxury of being able to have flexibility from work to be able to engage on boards, commissions, and city council meetings. So there is a disconnect between the project and the system. And so when I'm talking about institutional and systems work, that's what I mean, meaningfully thinking about how local government is in service or not, create as a bigger barrier in creating access and engagement. We think about that as we want to advance educational and economic opportunities among immigrants and refugees. And many of our partner organizations are doing incredible work in this area to ensure that there are, we're retaining immigrants who have been here for decades or are newcomers, and providing the upskilling that is required to keep them employed here in the San Jose region with good paying jobs. We also want to strengthen career pathways, especially for those who are new to the US and have degrees back home. How do we leverage some of those skills and into career pathways locally? And then safe communities is creating fostering trust and communications between law enforcement and local government and immigrants. So those are some of the ways at the very high level. These are the 4 pillars in our welcoming framework that forces us to rethink how local government serves and creates an environment of welcoming. On the next slide, you'll see some of the priorities that we have for this next year. I'm going to talk a little bit about Welcoming Week, which is right around the corner. Some of the other priorities as directed by the City Council was to identify, and we worked with local agencies to identify how we combat anti-Asian hate and some strategies related to that. We'll also be working with United Against Hate in November, addressing anti-Blackness within immigrant community dialogues, and information campaigns with local immigrant service organizations. We also are going to try this again, a civics online masterclass. We'll be hosting a Welcoming Interactive, which is a conference next spring hosted by Welcoming America, and we're hosting it in San Jose. It was in Charlotte, North Carolina last spring. They have chosen San Jose as their next conference, and we are super excited, and we'll be extending an invitation to you all to join us. It'll be in downtown San Jose. And there's a link to the Welcoming San Jose plan there as well. What I want to mention is that there are a lot of activities that we're working on, and as part of the racial equity work, it really is about, the policy making and institutional change that we want to create in order to make San Jose a much more welcoming place for Black, Indigenous, and people of color. But one of the things that we have found was that, there's a role of community, and there's a role that you all have in making San Jose a welcoming place. And Welcoming America calls that the role of the receiving community, right? So what is it that you can do to make San Jose a much more welcoming place? So we know that local government has a role, but what are you doing to build strong connections across communities and affirm that, how do we affirm the benefits of welcoming, for everyone? What are we doing to ensure that immigrants are seen and heard? Because when people are seen and heard, and this applies to women, when we feel seen and we feel heard, we feel like we belong. Sometimes it's just those interactions, and the being seen and heard could be in the small interactions. The being seen and heard to feel like people belong is in the way that we make decisions in whatever sphere of influence we have. To be seen and heard and make people feel like they belong is in the way that, we create space for people and voices. To value belonging means that you participate in events that look and feel different than what you know. And so there's going to be a lot of opportunities to do that in the next couple of weeks. So someone asked also, one of the questions that was asked ahead of the webinar or this talk was, how can the League support the work? And I have 4 things, and then I have call to action at the end. Participating in the events hosted by the Office of Racial Equity is one. Number two, be intentional about how the work of the league includes people and voices that represent the region. So give voice and create space for people, the diversity of the people that live in this region. Be part of co-creating a community of inclusion and belonging intentionally. Because when we're not intentionally thinking about inclusion and belonging, we unintentionally other. And stand in solidarity with groups different from your own. And so ways that you can do that, I'll be speaking to in just a minute. On the next slide, I also wanted to highlight the fact that San Jose was recently certified welcoming by Welcoming America. And certified welcoming means it's basically a formal designation for cities and counties that have created policies and programs reflecting the values and commitment to immigrant inclusion. So the designation is reserved for those places that meet a rigorous set of requirements set out in a welcoming standard guide. And so the San Jose became the second city in California to become welcoming or certified welcoming. And we're the 13th in the country. So again, we take great pride in the fact that we are now certified welcoming, but we also recognize that this doesn't mean that we're done. It just basically signals to us that we're on the right path. And there's still a lot more work ahead, not only for us to do as a local institution, but the variety of sectors and nonprofit organizations and school districts that have a responsibility to make San Jose a welcoming place. So on the next slide, you'll see a little bit about what I mentioned, the call to action. What are the kinds of things that you could do specifically to support immigrant inclusion? There's a variety of ways. You can volunteer at one of our partner organizations' many citizenship events. If you look at the Office of Racial Equity, there is a button there for Immigrant Affairs, and there are numerous nonprofit organizations that host regular citizenship events. In those citizenship events, basically, it's trying to get people who are eligible to naturalize to become US citizens. People need help with paperwork. People need help with translation or interpretation. People need help with studying for the civics exam. And many of that is also done in partnership with our libraries. So there are many volunteer opportunities there. You could also sponsor newly arrived immigrant residents or refugees. So for example, IRC is a local refugee receiving organization. They need sponsors. They need volunteers to help immigrants move into their new homes. They need cash assistance. They need furniture. They need support. And those are ways that we can help, especially newcomers, in making them feel like, welcome. They're here, they're going to call San Jose home. There are things that you could do at a personal level to help support newcomers. Another way is to become a partner in reading for ESL students at your local library. San Jose Library has a robust volunteer program, and they have the partner in reading programs. That's one way to commit some time on a regular basis to partner up with somebody. And a lot of this is done virtually now. You don't have to go to the library directly. Also become an ally and volunteer with the Rapid Response Network. So the Rapid Response Network is something that emerged during a few years ago when there was a lot of ICE presence and there was deportation of undocumented workers or undocumented people. And so the Rapid Response Network is essentially a group of people, of volunteers who have reaffirmed their commitment to keep families together in support of those impacted by immigration enforcement. So if you'd like to learn more about the Rapid Response Network, there is going to be a link. There's a link there. You can become a volunteer. It just takes one training. It's about 1 hour, and you can learn more about what that means and what that commitment looks like. I also invite you to celebrate the rich diversity of cultures in this region. Next weekend, there is a 2-day Mosaic Festival at the Mexican Heritage Plaza, and it is a wonderful event. I will be there most of the day on Saturday. When I said earlier that people feel like they belong when they're seen and they're heard. This is one way of doing it. Show up to the kinds of events where you are able to see the different cultures and hear the different musics and experience something different. Understanding cultures by way of art is a great way for interactions. It's a great way to shift any biases we might have. And so I invite you to participate in that. On the next slide, I also invite you to Welcoming Week. So part of Welcoming America, which is a national nonprofit organization that we're a member of, there's a Welcoming Week every September, and large cities have a concerted effort and set of activities that you all are invited to participate in. One particular area that I'd like to point your attention to is an event on September 18th. The City of San Jose hosts what's called Viva Calle San Jose, which is open streets. It's normally about a 7-mile stretch of streets that are protected, where no vehicles are allowed to drive through. And basically you could walk or cycle or rollerblade in this Viva Calle route. We, in coordination with Mosaic, will be hosting entertainment at Kelly Park, which is adjacent right next to Happy Hollow Park and Zoo. We invite you to come to the Welcoming Hub and learn more about what we do, and also just come and relax and listen to great music and have some good food. So in the final slide here, there are ways to contact us. So I've talked a lot about some of the upcoming events. I invite you to connect with us. There's an email address if you'd like to get on our listserv. You could also follow us on these social media platforms of Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. But I'll leave you with this. The Office of Racial Equity is aiming to achieve equity so that everyone can prosper and thrive in San Jose. History tells us that intersectional solidarity is the answer. So while we lead with a race, I want to emphasize that we don't end there. It's women's movement, it's the immigrant rights movement, LGBTQ, persons with disabilities. That intersectional solidarity is what helps to propel and will help us achieve equity on all fronts. I believe that meaningful transformation will require the coalition building against the systems that continue to burden women, communities of color, and other marginalized groups. Meaningful transformation for women will occur when we acknowledge that the fight for racial justice is absolutely related to gender equity. Meaningful transformation for women will be accelerated when we recognize the need to act now. So I am thrilled that you have invited me back to speak on some of the work that we're doing in the Office of Racial Equity specific to immigrant and welcoming work. And I want to thank you for participating today. So with that, I think we're going to hand it over to Barbara.
Well, thank you, Zulma, for that great overview. We'll now open the program to questions. I'd like to introduce Barbara Marshman, a League member and former editorial editor of the Mercury News, who will ask Zulma your questions. Please continue to send questions in on chat or as they occur to you. Or if you'd like to ask a question yourself, please click the raise hand button and we will call on you. Barbara, you're on.
Well, thank you. And thank you, Zulma, for doing this. It's really great to have you here and to have you in the city. Roma Dawson just sent a note to everyone saying Zulma participated in a League of Women Voters Bay Area League Educational Day on Equity. She was great. If you missed it, it's available on YouTube. So you have a fan club here, I believe is what we're saying. From the overall presentation, it's obvious that while racial equity is how we often think about things, your mission is much broader. It includes all women, it includes all immigrants, and has there been any thought of tinkering with the name?
Tinkering with the Office
The
of
name of
Racial
the office is
Equity.
racial equity, because it's so much broader what the
Uh,
work you're doing.
No, we have not given any thought to tinkering with the name. But that I'm glad you're bringing this up, because this is why we emphasize that while we lead with race, we don't end with race. But the reason that racial equity is a name that we decided was right for San Jose, as opposed to other cities do call them equity offices,
I
is
see.
because by any measure, the data tells us that when we look at health outcomes, there are deep and pervasive racial disparities. So when we think about health outcomes and we disaggregate that data by gender, we know that health outcomes for women are very different from men. When we disaggregate that gender data by race, we know that the health outcomes for Black women are far worse than they are for white women. They're far worse than they are for Latinas. And so it doesn't matter which particular indicator we're looking at. If we disaggregate that by race, you will always find the same pattern. And so that's why it's important for us to make that distinction that we're leading with race, but we don't end with race.
That really makes sense. Thank you. One of our audience members asked, can you talk about the charter amendment that's on the ballot for this fall? Now, I was on the Charter Commission, so I know a little bit about that discussion. I didn't agree with all of the recommendations we made, but the 4 that are on this ballot are just essential. And I wonder if you could talk about them a little bit.
Barbara, that's fantastic. I think you probably can speak to it better than I can, but I will say this. There is one piece in there that speaks to embedding racial equity principles and values. And I think that during the Charter Review Commission, there was a push to try to get more examples or try to get much more granular in what that meant. And I think the final language that will be voted on is pretty high level. It's sort of very aspirational, which I think is good for a couple of reasons. Number one, the vernacular around equity and racial equity and the terms that we use today may not be the same terms that we're going to hear in 5 or 10 years. And so we're trying to make sure that we can adapt, but the fact is the terminology may change, but the fact is we're still aiming for better outcomes for people who have been left out or underserved, right? And so the language that's in there, while general, still gives us some of the latitude that we need to, we know what we're aiming for, but the how we get there might change over time because this work is fairly new. I mean, if there's another city that has already figured this out, then, we would be following that path. But the fact is we're all still trying to sort out what it takes to get there. And so that's part of the language that you'll see on the ballot in November. And maybe Barbara, you can speak to the other pieces.
Well, one of them, and I'm just looking for one of them is elevating the Ethics Commission to a charter position so that it can't be brushed aside by future city councils. And I think that kind of speaks for itself. One of them is allowing non-electors, non-voting residents and non-citizens to serve on appointed boards and commissions. And do you want to talk a little bit about that? Is that part of your inclusion mission?
So, when we talk about barriers to civic engagement, immigration status is a barrier. And so I think that there's an opportunity here to think about why is immigration status important if the purpose of boards and commissions is to reflect community voice. And so the question I ask would be why not, right? So if the intent is to have boards and commissions that are reflective of the community and provide lived experience from community members about particular topic around parks or whatever it is, why does immigration status change? Why would that affect someone's opinion about their lived experience. And so, yeah, so thank you for the question.
Okay, you support all of the elements that are in that question. Ethics, inclusion. I'm actually just looking for
Yeah,
my.
if they fall under the principles of diversity, equity, and inclusion, yes. And so what do I mean by that is diversity is the what? Okay, the table looks diverse. Inclusion is, do they have a voice?
Okay.
And equity is maybe some shared power. That's how I would define it.
I will send out to everyone a document from SPUR, which is the organization in town and in San Francisco and in Oakland that tries to provide background information for good planning and so on. And we were supposed to meet this morning at our election committee, and we were not able to, but I was pleased to see that their analysis of that budget measure was all no problem with these. There is, what will do this, what's the problem? None. So I will send that to all league members, so because it's a good short assessment of what this is. I did want to clarify, because a couple of people asked what you would be doing with the schools, and would you explain your city and schools are entirely separate, and do you know if the schools are doing anything in this regard?
Yeah, I think the question was related to the influence that the city has on school districts. Gosh, and I honestly, I can't remember exactly how that question was posed, but in fact, I might have to look it up just to make sure that I answer it in a way that's meaningful.
I think I can find it.
I see. What is the city doing to address the inequities within schools? Because that's right. We are seeing racial disparities when we think about educational outcomes. And particularly in San Jose, the racial disparities exist between particularly Latinos. We have a large Latino population. We're kind of a city of thirds, a third Latino, a third Asian, a third white. When you look at the outcomes for Latino students are they're faring far worse. And so the question is, what is the city doing to address the inequities within school districts between affluent and poverty level neighborhoods? And so school districts, as long, and the county Office of Education, along with the California Department of Education, recognize the need to center equity in the decisions that they're making. I don't know how quickly we're going to be able to see how those decisions translate into allocations of funds that are poured into communities that have historically been underserved. And so we don't have purview over school districts, but what happens at the school district level certainly impacts what happens at an economic level in the city of San Jose and many other things, quality of life, right? And so there are while we're indirectly working to improve educational outcomes in San Jose, they are minimal, but they are through after-school programs and the Parks program. They are through youth programs out of the Parks, Recreation, and Neighborhood Services. They are through the variety of programs in the Office of Economic Development that help match mentors with youth, or summer jobs, or some trainings out of the library department. So the city has its hands in a lot of other supportive ways around education, but don't have jurisdiction over school districts.
Right. There's also a question about whether your office might have a role in dismantling systemic racism and exclusion in organizations in the city, whether private or nonprofit. Do you have any aspirations in that regard? Do you try to partner with organizations and encourage them to adopt some of the policies the city is adopting and looking at the way it addresses issues?
Yeah, that question is really interesting. And I get that one a lot. Like, what can I do to dismantle institutional racism?
Yeah.
And while the Office of Racial Equity, as much as I would love to have that much power, we can't change everything in the
No.
large city organization. But what we need to do, and what we're enabling departments, is to be able to recognize policies and practices that have not served certain communities, particularly communities of color or persons with disabilities or women. But let me answer that question by saying this, that we can't solve all things, dismantle the entire institutional racism, and neither can you in whatever sector that you're working in, right? So but I think what I like about this question is that, okay, you're asking that question because you're thinking about where do we begin to get there, right? We don't have the solution to get there yet because nobody's done it yet. But this is what I would say are steps that you all can take to dismantle systemic racism and exclusion in the organizations that you serve, whether private or otherwise. And these are the things. So number one, get comfortable talking about race and understand the terminology, because we cannot fix what we can't talk about. So whatever institution or organization that you're working with, if you still can't say race, racism, institutional racism, systemic racism, individuals racism, and bigotry, then you're probably not ready to dismantle it. So get comfortable talking about it and understand the terminology. Like earlier I said, there's a difference between diversity, equity, and inclusion. Know the difference, right? The other thing is, consider what steps you can take to center equity in your spheres of influence. So it's first practicing what this means to center equity. You can't expect the organization to center equity if you're actually not practicing it yourself. And so that requires a little bit of work. It requires requires a shift in mindset. I wish I could say that the tools that we've created automatically make you an equity practitioner and you could center equity in all that you do. I wish it were that easy, but what it is, it's really a critical thinking that's different from what we've already done. It's an anti-racist lens, because you could go along thinking that you're making a decision that's going to benefit women or persons with disabilities, but in the end, if you're not thinking about it differently, you're going to reproduce the same decisions, right, in the same policy making. The third is be patient with one another and be patient with yourself. There's a lot of calling out of people, and that kind of just keeps people away. I think it's more be patient with people as they're learning the terminology, learning the concepts, and trying to understand how people position themselves in ways that advances racial equity. The fourth one is, be a bridge to what's possible and use your lived experience. So many times we think that, oh, you've got to be a professional in this to actually do this work. No, we as women, we bring our gender lens, or my Latina lens, or my bilingual lens, or my immigration status lens. I'm going to bring my lived experience to this work, because if I don't, then how does that benefit this work? Number 5, be an anti-racist. It's not enough to not be racist. 6, understand the history, the inflection points, and policies that have generated and perpetuated racial disparities and injustice. And that's part of the education we need to do. Be part of co-creating a new social contract. And number 8, vote for people and policies who endorse the existence of women, immigrants, Black, Native, and people of color in general. So those are just some ways that we begin to shift an equity mindset to an equity agenda.
Yeah, I'm a member of a couple of organizations that really want to do that and broaden. San Jose Rotary is one of them. And I'm not sure, because a lot of the leader, I'm a relatively recent member, but a lot of the leadership has been there a long time, and they really want to do this work, and they are doing it by recruiting members of color. They're already almost half women. Is there a resource for organizations like that, not city departments, but organizations like that might want to take training in just some of the things that you just raised? Actually, is there any kind of resource out there?
You know, I wish I could point you to one. But let me point you, well, it's really mostly for local governments. And it's the Government Alliance on Race and Equity is a community of practice that municipalities across the US are using. It's a place of lots of great resources. But aside from that, there are also a lot of consultants out there, some better than others, obviously. There are a lot of diversity, equity, and inclusion consultants that can help at least provide foundational training, because again, it's understanding the concepts, it's understanding the terminology, it's then understanding the difference between individual, institutional, and systemic racism. It's normalizing these terms in ways that are benefiting and contributing to conversations. And that's a culture shift. So there are consultants out there that work in this space. The only caution I would give is, like I said earlier, I feel like, or maybe I didn't say this, diversity is a gateway conversation. And while it's good to diversify our boards, it's good to diversify our membership, that will only go so far. It's about how much power we're giving that diverse group of people in shaping the agenda for organizations.
Thank you. And I will ask you for the name of that report again later when I'm in a position to actually write it down. Or maybe you could email it out. It does sound like it could be of use to organizations as well as government, because the concepts apply everywhere. A couple of folks have asked about historical inequity in the city and the impacts that's had on things like parks in East San Jose and different. Is there any effort on the part of is it part of your mandate to look at that in any way, or is anyone else looking at that?
Yeah, so I will say that Parks, Recreation, and Neighborhood Services has been in this business with us as allies for the last couple of years. And they have equity practitioners in that department that are very keenly aware at looking at the historical influencers of why certain communities in San Jose look and feel the way that they do, why certain parks are under-resourced. And, you know, a lot of it has to do with redlining. And we have, redlining is something that was endorsed by the federal government, many decades ago, which allowed the federal government to basically give a rating to certain neighborhoods. And that rating influenced property values in homes and that sort of thing. But that rating was influenced by the people who lived there. And so if you look at the San Jose Equity Atlas, it's in beta form, it's not perfect, but we have there, the San Jose Equity Atlas is basically a set of maps, and it shows the redlining maps, and then it shows a layer of data, pieces of data, and it'll show that in the areas that were redlined decades ago, you will find racial disparities. And you'll also find when you map out community centers and parks that those have been under-resourced. And so you have to think about so that happened a long time ago. And while we're not responsible for what happened a long time ago, we are responsible for repairing that. And so acknowledging the fact that that was a problem back then, and that even 20 years ago, when I was in Parks and Rec, I remember there was a bond that was passed. And from that bond, it was decided that we should have equal distribution of dollars so that we could have one new community center in every council district, rather than thinking about, well, which are actually the council districts that could really use the resources. It was just done equally. And so today we're feeling the ramifications of those decisions. And so again, we weren't responsible. We weren't maybe there to make those decisions then, but we are now responsible to reversing some of the effects.
And that is a commitment by the city by Parks and Rec and.
Yeah, and the commitment as a city of a whole, when we talk about advancing racial equity, is to making sure that we're moving in that direction where race no longer determines life outcomes and everybody has an opportunity to live well and to thrive.
Okay, I'm gonna check here. I have a few more questions coming in. Okay, I guess these are not questions. They're lovely comments. Oh, there is one, as an Asian American, and this is from a prominent league member, Gloria Chun-Hu. As an Asian American, tell us about data around Asian hate crimes or instances in San Jose and the Bay Area. We hear a lot about San Francisco incidents, a little bit about Alameda County. I'm not familiar with a lot in San Jose. Can you enlighten us?
I think I can enlighten some. I unfortunately I don't have the data at the available to me like right now. I honestly cannot remember the data, but this is what I do know. During COVID, and we've known that there has always been an issue with anti-Asian hate. It wasn't just COVID that brought this on. There's always been, decades, and there's been evidence of targeted hate crimes against Asian Pacific Islanders. So that we've known for a long time. Stop Anti-Asian Hate is a website that you can go to look at the data for every region, and there's some localized data there. We used that data to inform the combating anti-Asian hate strategies in the city of San Jose. And so as a result, we have a set of strategies. In fact, there's going to be an information memo we're working on that will get sent out publicly that speaks to updates on the kinds of strategies that are in there, and working closely with the county of Santa Clara to ensure that there's some coordination on that. Some of them are very tactical strategies, like let's make sure that people, particularly older adult mature generation of API community members, have a booklet that's called How to Report Hate Crimes. And this booklet's been translated in multiple languages. So we want to get that in the hands of people. There are also safety kits that we're going to be distributing that have whistles and things. That's very tactical, and that serves after the fact. There's also things that we are looking at that include, some coordination with the San Jose Police Department, with the county DA's office, and thinking also with the county with the types of policies that ought to be created that protect and preserve the well-being of the API community. Having said all of that, while there's this hyper focus on combating anti-Asian hate, I still want to take us back to when we look at hate crimes and crimes against people of color. Black people are targeted at a very high rate. And so the data shows us that. And again, when you disaggregate the data by race, you will always see that there are certain groups that are worse off. But in the set of strategies that we're focusing on, along with the county, they are very specific to combating anti-Asian hate in the San Jose and Santa Clara County region.
Thank you.
Great question.
Yes, it is a great question. In that regard, one of your action items was dealing with safety in immigrant neighborhoods, and you mentioned on the slide working with the police. How does that go these days? There was a time maybe 20 years ago when it seemed like San Jose police were a little bit evening out their relationships with communities, and that seems to have gone awry over the past few years. Do you get cooperation from the police department in trying to work with these communities?
Yes, there's actually two things I want to say about that. When we wrote drafted the Welcoming San Jose plan with our community partners and community. This was very high. This notion of safety was prominently noted by community members, that they didn't feel safe. And a large part of that was driven by the fact that ICE was deporting people at a higher rate during the Trump administration than they were today. And so when we talk about safety, it was the, questions from the undocumented community to the city about, are you collaborating with ICE and is the San Jose Police Department collaborating with ICE to deport people, separate families, which essence, when you separate families and you deport the head of household, you're basically putting families out on the street. So it's devastating. And what we wanted to affirm, and we worked with the San Jose Police Departments to affirm that we do not collaborate with ICE. And the San Jose Police Department, under its new chief, Mata, have been very diligent about doing much more foot patrols and increasing community relations so that they have interactions and positive experiences, right? That immigrants, particularly undocumented immigrants who are most fearful, have more positive experiences with San Jose Police Department so that they could be trusted to be called upon if anything happens in their communities. Because for a while, there was so much, there are people who can't really make the distinction. And I mean, sometimes we can't make a distinction between San Jose Police Department, a county sheriff representative, and ICE. And so when we see people with badges coming into our communities, there's this fear. And you don't know if you see a crime, you don't even know if you want to report it for fear of being implicated and being deported yourself. And so I think while, that those fears still exist, there's still some work to do to kind of elevate the confidence level again for the immigrant community to call when there are problems and they need to call 911. But also to trust particularly the beat officers who are trying to build relationships out there.
So the new chief has really tried to work on that, I gather.
Yeah, and specifically Chief Mata was part of the development of the Welcoming San Jose plan way before he was a chief. He was a lieutenant, and then he grew through the ranks. But in 2015, he actually chaired the Safety Communities Subcommittee that created the original set of goals. And so he heard directly from people, and some things were difficult to hear. And so as he is elevated into the ranks and all the way to chief, he has always kept his ear to the ground. And we hope that he will continue to center community voices in thinking through how do you change the culture in the police department to be much more welcoming and create relationships with communities that are meaningful and not transactional.
Taryn, were you trying to?
Oh, it's time.
Break in here, right? Or
Well,
can we keep going? I could keep going all day. This is a great discussion.
Well, I do want to thank Zulma for sharing her time and expertise today. She has agreed to stay on after we formally close the program in case you'd like to talk further with her. I also want to thank you, Barbara, for your time today, helping to field the questions. In the meantime, please make note of our special Lunch with League program on September 15th, titled Don't Get Duped by Misinformation, with Cameron Hickey of the Algorithmic Transparency Institute and the National Conference on Citizenship. He will describe the dis and misinformation tactics used, the reasons they work, and how to respond effectively. He presented a dynamic workshop on this topic at the League's National Convention in June. That was one of the best, and we are fortunate to have time on his very busy pre-election schedule when dis and misinformation ramps up across the country. Registration is now open for this event, so sign up early to reserve your space. There are several other educational events being planned by leagues in Santa Clara County in September and October. And of course, our league will be hosting many candidate forums and pros and cons presentations prior to the November election. To stay on top of these busy times, watch for our monthly newsletter, The Voter, and check our website, lwvsjsc.org, for more information. Thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you at future Lunch with League programs. And for those who want to stay on,